Lieutenant Commander Edward Parker saw the bomb that was going to kill him. It detached from the Aichi dive bomber at 2,500 feet, a black cylinder tumbling through grey Pacific sky. October 26, 1942, 200 miles northwest of Santa Cruz Islands. Parker stood in the fire control director of the USS Enterprise, binoculars pressed against his face so hard the metal rim cut into his cheekbones. He tracked the bomb's arc downward. The mathematics ran through his head automatically after 10 months of war. 500-pound weapon, terminal velocity around 700 feet per second, impact in 3 seconds. The bomb would hit the flight deck 40 feet from where he stood. The blast would turn this director station into shrapnel. Parker had time to think one coherent thought. We fired 350 shells, and none of them stopped this. The bomb hit the destroyer Smith instead. The destroyer had moved into the bomb's path, trying to shield Enterprise. Parker watched the explosion tear through Smith's forward deck. Metal peeled back like paper. Fire erupted from the wound. Men were burning on that ship. Parker could see them through his binoculars. Small figures wreathed in flames, some jumping into the ocean, some not moving at all. The ship that had saved Enterprise was dying. Parker's hands were shaking. He forced them still and grabbed the intercom handset. Target bearing 285. Range decreasing. 9 more dive bombers in the formation. They were already rolling into their attack runs. Parker called firing solutions to the gun crews below. Elevation 73 degrees. Deflection right 4 degrees. Commence firing. Enterprise shuddered as her main battery of 5-inch guns opened up. The sky filled with black smoke puffs. Each puff marked where a shell had exploded 18 seconds after leaving the gun. 18 seconds. In that time, a diving aircraft traveling at 250 miles per hour covered more than half a mile. Parker was trying to predict where each plane would be 18 seconds in the future. He was trying to place an explosion in empty air where his target had not yet arrived. Most of the time, he failed. He watched a dive bomber fly straight through a barrage that should have killed it. The plane was a single-engine Aichi D-3A, what intelligence called a VAL. Parker saw it clearly. The fixed landing gear, the pilot's canopy reflecting sunlight, the red circle on the fuselage, the 550-pound bomb slung under its belly. The bomber was close enough that Parker could see the pilot's helmet. The American shells exploded around the aircraft, above it, below it, behind it. None of them hit. The VAL released its bomb at 1,500 feet. Parker followed the bomb down. It struck Enterprise's flight deck near the forward elevator. The explosion made the entire ship lurch. Parker felt it through his boots, through his bones. A column of fire punched through the deck. Metal fragments screamed past the director station. Something hot touched Parker's left arm. He looked down. A piece of shrapnel the size of his thumb had torn through his sleeve and cut a line across his bicep. Blood soaked into the cloth. Parker barely felt it. The second bomb hit 20 seconds later. This one penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay below. Smoke poured from the elevator shaft, thick black smoke that meant fuel fires. Parker knew what happened in a hangar bay when bombs exploded. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedo warheads cooked off. Men died in ways that made closed casket funerals a mercy. He had seen it before. He would see it again. But right now, he had a job to do. More bombers were coming. He could see them forming up for another attack run. Parker called new targeting solutions. The guns kept firing. The shells kept missing. After the attack, after the fires were under control, after the wounded were taken below and the dead were counted, Parker went to the plotting room. His arm was bandaged now. The cut was not deep. 12 stitches. The doctor had told him he was lucky. Parker did not feel lucky. He felt sick. The plotting room kept detailed records of every engagement, rate of fire for each gun, rounds expended, targets engaged, results. Parker found the file for the Battle of Santa Cruz. The numbers told a story he already knew. Enterprise had fired 402 5-inch anti-aircraft shells during the attack. The entire task force had fired over 2,000. They had shot down 5 attacking aircraft, maybe 6 if you counted the plane that crashed after being damaged. That meant roughly 350 shells fired per kill. Parker had a notebook. He had been keeping it since December 1941, since Pearl Harbor, since the war began. The notebook contained engagement data from every naval battle in the Pacific. Parker updated it after every action. The numbers formed a pattern. At Pearl Harbor, American anti-aircraft guns had fired approximately 2,400 rounds to shoot down 9 Japanese aircraft. That was 267 shells per kill. By Coral Sea in May 1942, the average was 310 shells per kill. At Midway in June, it was 320. Now at Santa Cruz, it was 350. The curve was going the wrong direction. American accuracy was not improving. It was getting worse. The Japanese pilots were learning. They were getting better at evasive maneuvers. They knew how American time fuses worked. They knew the shells would explode at a preset altitude. All they had to do was not be at that altitude when the shells arrived. Change your dive angle at the last second. Jink left or right. Pull up earlier than expected. Simple tactics. Effective tactics. Tactics that killed American sailors. The problem was not the guns. Parker knew this. American 5-inch 38 caliber guns were excellent weapons. Accurate, reliable, fast-firing. Each gun could put a shell 6 miles into the sky and do it 15 times per minute. The problem was not the ammunition. American shells carried more explosive than their Japanese equivalents. The problem was the fuses. Every anti-aircraft shell needed a fuse to make it explode. 2 types existed. Contact fuses that detonated on impact. Time fuses that exploded after a preset delay. Contact fuses only worked if you scored a direct hit on a fast-moving target miles away. This almost never happened. A 5-inch shell was 6 inches wide. An aircraft might be 40 feet wide. At 6 miles distance, that target looked smaller than a pinhead. Hitting it was mathematically possible, but practically impossible. Time fuses were more common. These exploded at a specific altitude, creating a cloud of steel fragments the target had to fly through. But time fuses required knowing exactly where your target would be when your shell reached maximum altitude. You had to calculate the target's current altitude, speed, heading, rate of climb or descent. You had to factor in wind speed, air density, temperature, the rotation of the Earth. You had to set all these calculations into a mechanical fuse before loading the shell into the gun. And you had 18 seconds to be right. Parker looked at his notebook. 350 shells per kill. Enterprise carried 1 205-inch rounds in her magazines. At current effectiveness rates, that was enough ammunition to stop 3.5 attacking aircraft. A typical Japanese attack wave contained 20 to 30 planes. The mathematics were brutal. If every shell hit its target, Enterprise could defend herself. But shells did not hit their targets. They exploded in the wrong place at the wrong time because no human could predict the future accurately enough. The Japanese knew this. They trained their pilots to exploit it. American fire control officers could calculate where an aircraft would be in 18 seconds, but the Japanese pilots made those calculations wrong by changing course at 17 seconds. Simple, effective, deadly. Parker closed his notebook. His arm hurt now. The local anesthetic was wearing off. He could feel each of the 12 stitches pulling at his skin. He thought about the men who had died today. Enterprise had lost 44 killed, 75 wounded. The destroyer Smith was still burning. Repair crews were trying to save her, but Parker had seen the damage. Smith would not make it back to Pearl Harbor. Across the task force, the butcher's bill kept rising. USS Hornet had taken 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. The carrier was dead in the water, listing, burning. Tugboats were trying to tow her to safety. They would fail. Hornet would sink tonight. Task Force 61 had entered the battle with 2 operational fleet carriers. It would leave with 1. The Japanese had 4 carriers operating in the South Pacific. The balance of power was tilting, not because American ships were poorly built, not because American sailors were poorly trained, but because American anti-aircraft weapons could not stop determined attacks. Hundreds of guns, thousands of shells, all of it firing into the sky, most of it exploding harmlessly in empty air. At the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, analysts compiled these same numbers. Their conclusion appeared in a classified report dated November 1942. Current anti-aircraft effectiveness is insufficient to prevent determined enemy attacks. At present kill rates, the fleet cannot sustain operations in contested airspace without prohibitive losses. The report included projections. If effectiveness did not improve, the Navy would lose every carrier in the Pacific within 18 months. Not from superior Japanese weapons, not from better Japanese tactics, from the simple mathematics of attrition. The Japanese could launch attacks faster than American guns could stop them. The report ended with a recommendation. A revolutionary increase in fuze effectiveness is required immediately. Incremental improvements are insufficient. The Navy needs a weapon that can hit what it cannot predict, a weapon that thinks. Parker did not see this report. He did not know analysts in Washington were reaching the same conclusions he had written in his notebook. He only knew what he had witnessed. American anti-aircraft fire was not working. Men were dying because shells exploded in the wrong place. The Navy needed something better, something revolutionary, something impossible. A shell that could find its target by itself. A shell with eyes. A shell that could see an aircraft in the sky and know exactly when to explode. A shell with a brain. That weapon existed. But on October 26, 1942, only 47 people in the United States knew about it. Lieutenant Commander Edward Parker was not one of them. Neither were the gunners who had fired over 2,000 shells that day. Neither were the 44 men who had died on Enterprise. The weapon existed in a laboratory 5,000 miles away. It was classified at the highest level, more secret than radar, more protected than the Manhattan Project, and it was about to change everything. The vacuum tube exploded in Merle Tuvey's hand, not loudly, just a sharp crack and a spray of hot glass across his palm. Tuvey dropped the remains and watched blood well up from a dozen tiny cuts. That made 63 failed prototypes in 4 weeks. He picked glass fragments out of his skin one by one and dropped them into the trash can that already held the shattered remains of tubes 1 through 62. His hand was shaking, not from pain, from exhaustion and something worse. The growing certainty that what the Navy wanted could not be built. May 1940, Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Carnegie Institution, Washington. Tuvey was 40 years old. He had a wife who barely saw him, 2 daughters who asked when Daddy was coming home, a doctorate in physics from Johns Hopkins, and a problem that was destroying him. The British had sent specifications for a radio fuse that could detect enemy aircraft. The concept was brilliant. Put a tiny radio transmitter inside an artillery shell. When the shell got close to a target, the radio signal would bounce back and trigger the explosion. The Navy wanted 20,000 of these fuses. They wanted them to work inside 5-inch anti-aircraft shells. Shells that experienced 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired. Tuvey had to fit a working radio inside something the size of a coffee mug and make it survive forces that turned vacuum tubes into powder. He looked at the pile of broken glass. 4 weeks of work, 63 failures, and every single one told him the same thing. It was impossible. Standard vacuum tubes shattered at 100 times gravity. The best military-hardened tubes could handle maybe 500 times gravity. He needed tubes that could survive 40 times that. Nobody had ever built tubes that durable. Most engineers said it could not be done. The laws of physics said it could not be done. But sailors were dying in the Pacific because anti-aircraft guns could not hit their targets. Tuvey wrapped a handkerchief around his bleeding hand and went back to work. Richard Roberts found him at 2 in the morning, asleep at his desk, with his head on a pile of technical drawings. Roberts was Tuve's assistant, 26 years old, too thin, surviving on coffee and determination. He shook Tuve's shoulder. "Dr. Tuve." Tuve jerked awake. The drawings stuck to his face. He peeled them off. "What time is it?" 2:15. "You need to go home." Tuve rubbed his eyes. His glasses left red marks on his nose. "How many tubes did we test today?" Roberts consulted his notebook. 17. All failures. Highest survival was 3,400 times gravity. Still not enough. Tuve put his head back down on the desk. "We are not going to solve this, Richard. I have been lying to Vannevar Bush. I have been lying to the Navy. I have been telling them we are making progress, but we are not making progress. We are just failing in slightly different ways." Roberts sat down. "You want to quit?" "No." "Yes." "I do not know." Tuve looked at his bandaged hand. Blood had soaked through the handkerchief. "When I was in graduate school, I studied cosmic rays. Do you know what cosmic rays are?" Roberts nodded. "High-energy particles from space." Tuve smiled without humor. "I spent 5 years measuring things that had no practical application whatsoever. Pure research. Beautiful problems with no immediate consequences. If I got the answer wrong, nobody died. Now I am trying to build a weapon. And if I fail, sailors die. Ships sink. We lose the war. And I do not know how to build what they need." Roberts was quiet for a moment. "Then we find someone who does." That was how Lawrence Hafstad joined the team. Hafstad was 42, older than Tuve, with more engineering experience. He arrived in June 1940 and spent his first week just reading failure reports. 63 tubes tested, 63 tubes destroyed. Tuve showed him the latest design. "We have tried everything. Thicker glass, stronger filaments, shock-absorbing mounts. Nothing survives the forces." Hafstad studied the drawings. "You have been trying to protect fragile tubes. That is the wrong approach." Tuve frowned. "What is the right approach?" "Stop building fragile tubes. Build something that does not need protection." Hafstad sketched a new design. 4 smaller tubes instead of 1 large tube. Each tube does a single job. Transmit, amplify, receive, detonate. Smaller tubes are inherently stronger. Fewer parts, fewer points of failure. Tuve looked at the sketch. "This would require completely redesigning the circuit." "Yes." "And rebuilding all our test equipment." "Yes." "And training new personnel." "Yes." "And it might not work." Hafstad met his eyes. "But it might." The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Tuve had finally gone home. He had been asleep for 90 minutes. He picked up the receiver. "This is Tuve." The voice belonged to Vannevar Bush. "Merle, I am looking at casualty reports from the Pacific. USS Lexington damaged. USS Yorktown under attack. Japanese bombers getting through our anti-aircraft fire. How close are you to a working fuse?" Tuve's throat was dry. "We are redesigning the entire system. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have." Bush's voice went cold. "The president wants to know if this project is viable. If you cannot deliver, tell me now so I can reallocate resources." Tuve thought about the 63 failed tubes. He thought about the new design Hafstad had proposed. He thought about the sailors dying in the Pacific because American guns could not hit aircraft that were right there in the sky in front of them. "Give me 8 weeks." Bush was silent. The silence stretched out. Then he said, 8 weeks, Merle. Not 9. Not 10. If you do not have a working prototype in 8 weeks, this project ends. The line went dead. Tuve did not go back to sleep. He drove to the lab. Hafstad and Roberts were already there. They had been there all night. Tuve told them about the call. 8 weeks. We have 8 weeks to build something that has never been built before, or the project gets cancelled. The 3 men looked at each other. Then Hafstad said, "We need more people." "How many more?" Hafstad did a calculation in his head. 30 engineers, 20 technicians, 10 glassblowers who can handcraft custom tubes, access to machine shops that can build precision parts, and a new facility because this building is not big enough. Tuve picked up the phone. Bush's secretary answered. "Put me through to Dr. Bush. This is an emergency." By July 1940, Tuve had authorization to hire anyone he needed and commandeer any facility. Bush had called it the highest priority project in the National Defense Research Committee. More important than radar. More secret than anything except work that would later become the Manhattan Project. Tuve moved his team to a new laboratory on Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building had space for 150 people. Within 2 months, every desk was full. Engineers from General Electric, RCA, Westinghouse, physicists from universities, technicians from the telephone company, glassblowers who had been making light bulbs, now making vacuum tubes smaller and stronger than any tubes in existence. The laboratory ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Test results from the night shift appeared on Tuve's desk every morning. Most of them still read failure. August 1940, Tube 97 survived 5,000 times gravity. Progress, but not enough. Tube 104 survived 8,000 times gravity. Better, still not enough. Tube 109 survived 12,000 times gravity. Getting close. Tube 114 survived 16,000 times gravity. Almost there. Tube 122 survived 19,000 times gravity. Tuve stopped sleeping entirely. He lived in the laboratory. His wife brought him clean clothes twice a week. His daughters forgot what he looked like. September 15th, 1940, 4 in the morning. Tuve was in the testing bay, watching Roberts load Tube 130 into the centrifuge. The centrifuge was a steel drum that spun samples at high speed, simulating gun barrel forces. Roberts closed the drum and started the motor. The wine built, 5,000 times gravity. The tube held, 10,000, still holding, 15,000, holding, 20,000, holding. Roberts looked at the pressure gauge. The tube was still intact. Tuve felt his heart hammering. Keep going. 22,000 times gravity. The tube held, 25,000, still holding. At 27,000 times gravity, the tube finally shattered. Roberts stopped the centrifuge and opened the drum. He stared at the fragments. Tuve was already writing in his notebook. Tube 130 failed at 27,000 times gravity. 35% above requirement. He looked up. Roberts was grinning. Tuve realized he was grinning too. Build another one. Roberts was already moving. If we can repeat this result, we have a working design. They repeated it. Tube 131 survived 26,000 times gravity. Tube 132 survived 24,000. Tube 133 survived 28,000. The design was reproducible. They had solved the acceleration problem. Tuve called Bush at 6 in the morning. We have a working tube. Bush's relief was audible even through the phone line. How soon can you build a complete fuse? Tuve looked at the prototype on his desk. The tube was one component. He still needed to integrate it with the radio circuit, the power supply, the detonator, the safety mechanisms. 6 weeks for a working prototype, another 8 weeks for field testing. Bush did a calculation. That puts us in December. Can you go faster? No. Yes. Maybe. I do not know. Bush's voice hardened. Make it 10 weeks total. I need working fuses by Thanksgiving. Tuve hung up and looked at his team. We have 10 weeks. October 1940. The complete fuse was the size of a coffee mug and weighed 18 ounces. 4 custom vacuum tubes, a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver circuit, a battery that would power the system for 60 seconds, a safety mechanism that prevented accidental detonation, an arming mechanism that activated after the shell had traveled 300 yards from the gun, and a detonator that would fire when the return radio signal reached the right strength, indicating a target was within lethal range. Every component had to survive 20,000 times gravity. Every component had to work in temperatures ranging from -40 to +140 degrees Fahrenheit. Every component had to function after being spun at 30,000 revolutions per minute. Every component had to remain dormant for months in a ship's magazine and then work perfectly on the first try because there would be no second chance. The first field test happened on November 20th, 1940, at the Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground in Virginia. Tuve, Hafstad and Roberts drove down with a crate of prototype fuses. Navy observers watched as technicians loaded the fuses into 5-inch shells. The test target was a B-17 bomber, piloted by remote control, flying at 12,000 feet. The first shell was fired at 0900 hours. Tuve watched through binoculars. The shell exploded 75 feet from the target. Miss. The second shell exploded 50 feet from the target. Closer. The third shell exploded 15 feet from the target. The B-17's left wing tore apart. The bomber tumbled out of the sky. The Navy observers were silent. Then one of them, a commander with 20 years of service, turned to Tuve. "How many of these can you build?" Tuve's hands were shaking again. Not from exhaustion this time. "How many do you need?" The commander looked back at the burning wreckage. "As many as you can make. We need them yesterday." Production started in January 1941. Western Electric, Sylvania, Raytheon, Eastman Kodak. Every company that could manufacture precision electronics got contracts. The proximity fuse was classified above top secret. Workers who built components did not know what they were building. Only final assembly personnel saw complete fuses. Security was tighter than any program in American history. German and Japanese spies were everywhere. If the enemy discovered how the fuse worked, they could develop countermeasures or copy the technology. The Navy issued strict orders. Proximity fuses could only be used over water, where a dud shell would sink without trace. Never over land where the enemy might recover an intact fuse. The secret had to be protected at any cost. By August 1941, the fuse was ready for combat trials. USS Cleveland took a batch of proximity fuses to sea for live fire exercises. The results were classified immediately, but word spread through the Bureau of Ordnance anyway. The proximity fuse worked. It worked better than anyone had dared hope. Instead of 350 shells per kill, the Navy was now achieving kills with between 20 and 40 shells. In some tests, with experienced crews and optimal conditions, the number dropped to as low as 12 shells per kill, a 30 times improvement in effectiveness. Anti-aircraft fire that had been nearly useless was now deadly. Tuve read the combat trial reports in his office. Alone. It was late. Everyone else had gone home. He thought about the 63 failed tubes at the beginning, the cuts on his hand from broken glass, the phone call from Bush that almost ended the project, the 10 weeks of panic that had felt like 10 years. All of it had worked. The weapon existed. The weapon functioned. Soon, it would be saving lives. Tuve put his head down on his desk and cried. Not from sadness, from relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning. But the war was about to get worse before it got better. In 3 months, Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. American ships would burn. American sailors would die. And Tuve's proximity fuse would still be classified so secret that almost nobody in the fleet knew it existed. The weapon that could save the Navy was locked away because Washington was terrified the enemy would discover how it worked. Sailors would keep dying, ships would keep sinking, and the proximity fuse would sit in warehouses, unused, while the people who had built it screamed that they had the solution, but nobody was listening. Captain William Callahan was holding a crate he was not allowed to open. January 3rd, 1943. USS Helena, anchored off Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. The crate had arrived that morning on a supply ship from Pearl Harbor. No manifest, no paperwork. Just a priority code Callahan had never seen before, and instructions stamped in red ink across every surface. Top secret. Authorized personnel only. Do not open over land. Callahan commanded Helena's gunnery division, 20 years in the Navy. He had opened thousands of ammunition crates. This was the first time anyone had told him where he could and could not open one. He carried the crate down to the 5-inch magazine himself, did not trust it to anyone else. Chief Gunner's mate Tom Sullivan was waiting. Sullivan was 43, bald, built like a whiskey barrel, with anchor tattoos covering both forearms. He had been loading naval guns since 1918. He looked at the crate. "What is special delivery, sir?" Callahan set it on the deck. "Something Washington does not want the Japanese to know about." Sullivan read the security stamps. "Variable time fuse. Never heard of that." "Neither have I. Orders say we load these for the next air raid, and if the ship is in danger of capture, we destroy them." "Destroy ammunition?" Sullivan frowned. "Sir, we usually want to keep ammunition, not according to these orders." Callahan broke the seal. Inside were 45-inch shells. They looked normal except for the nose. Where a standard time fuse had mechanical gears and a clockwork mechanism, these had what looked like vacuum tubes, glass, electronics, components that belonged in a radio, not an artillery shell. Sullivan picked up one of the shells. His hands were careful, almost reverent. "This is electronics, sir, in an artillery shell." He turned it over, examining it from every angle. "That is impossible. The firing forces would destroy it in milliseconds." Callahan picked up the instruction sheet. According to this, these fuses survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. Sullivan set the shell down like it might detonate if he breathed wrong. "That is witchcraft." Callahan kept reading. "Each shell cost $60. Sullivan made a noise. $60. "Sir, a regular 5-inch shell costs $20. $60 is more money than I make in a month. For one shell. That better hit something." Callahan folded the instruction sheet. "It will. Load them in gun 5. And Sullivan, do not tell anyone what these are. If word gets out, I answer to an admiral. Understood?" The Japanese attack came 2 days later, January 5th, 1943, 4:17 in the afternoon. Helena was patrolling off Cape Hunter when Combat Information Center reported incoming aircraft, bearing 350 degrees, range 12 miles, closing at 240 knots. Callahan ran to his battle station in the aft fire control director. Through binoculars, he saw them. 6 Aichi dive bombers, Val Type 99s, the same aircraft that had hit Enterprise at Santa Cruz, the same type that had killed 44 American sailors 2 months ago, the same type that American anti-aircraft guns could not stop reliably. Helena's conventional batteries opened up, 5-inch guns across the ship firing. The sky filled with black smoke puffs, where time-fused shells exploded at preset altitudes. Callahan watched the Japanese pilots fly through the barrage. They knew the American pattern. Jink left when shells burst right. Dive steeper when the barrage gets dense. Pull out early if shells cluster below. Every pilot in the Japanese Navy had been trained to defeat time-fused anti-aircraft fire. And it worked. The black puffs exploded everywhere except where the aircraft were. The first bomber released at 2,000 feet. Callahan tracked the bomb through his director optics. It fell toward Helena's port side. The explosion threw up a column of water that soaked the deck. Near miss, 30 feet from impact. If the bomb had been 30 feet to starboard, it would have hit the ship. The second bomber was diving. Callahan grabbed the fire control telephone. "Gun 5. Load the special shells." Sullivan's voice came back immediately. "The secret ones, sir." "Yes, load them now. Stand by for fire mission." The gun crew moved fast. Callahan watched through the director window. They had practiced this. The breech opened. A shell went in. The secret shell. The $60 shell. The breech closed. The gun elevated. Callahan calculated the firing solution. The bomber was pulling out of its dive at 1,500 feet, starting to climb, preparing to turn away. Range 8,200 yards. Elevation 73 degrees. Deflection right 2 degrees. Fire. The gun fired. The shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. 20,000 times the force of gravity tried to crush the vacuum tubes inside. The tubes survived. The shell climbed. Callahan tracked it through his optics. A dark speck against grey clouds, rising, spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute. The bomber kept climbing. 2,000 feet, 2,500 feet. Standard procedure said Callahan should be guessing where that bomber would be in 18 seconds, calculating altitude, setting the fuse to explode at that estimated height, hoping his guess was correct. But this shell did not need guesses. This shell had a brain. The radio transmitter inside activated, sent out a signal. The signal bounced off the bomber, came back. The shell calculated distance. Optimal detonation range was 70 feet. The shell waited, kept climbing. The return signal got stronger. 60 feet, 50, 40, 30, 20. The shell exploded. Callahan saw everything through his optics. The flash appeared right next to the bomber, maybe 20 feet from the fuselage. Perfect range for fragmentation kill. He saw the cockpit canopy shatter, saw fragments tear through aluminum skin like paper. The right wing folded backwards at an impossible angle. The fuel tank in that wing ignited. Fire erupted, orange flame against grey sky. The bomber stopped being an aircraft and became debris. It tumbled sideways, pieces breaking off as it fell. The tail section separated. The engine tore loose. Black smoke trailed. 6 seconds from detonation to ocean impact. The water swallowed what was left. Sullivan's voice came over the telephone. His voice was shaking. "Sir, what the hell just happened?" That shell knew where the target was. Callahan could not explain it, could barely process what he had seen. "That is not possible, but I just watched it happen." "Load another one." Gun 5 reloaded. The third bomber was lining up its attack. Callahan called the solution. Fire. The shell climbed, found the target, exploded at perfect range. The bomber disintegrated. Pieces fell into the ocean. Load another. Fourth bomber. Fire. Explosion. Kill. The remaining 2 Japanese bombers broke formation. They had watched 3 of their squadron die in 90 seconds. 3 bombers destroyed by shells that exploded at exactly the right moment without any visible pattern. The pilots did not understand what was happening. Neither did their commanders monitoring from base. All they knew was that Helena had become death. The surviving bombers fled. After the battle, Callahan went down to the magazine. Sullivan was sitting on an ammunition crate, staring at one of the secret shells. He did not look up when Callahan entered. The old gunner's hands were trembling. "Sir, what are these?" Callahan sat down next to him. The briefing said they are proximity fuses. The shell has a miniature radio inside, transmitter and receiver. When the radio signal bounces back from a target, the shell detonates automatically. No timer, no calculations. The shell decides when to explode. Sullivan held the shell like it was sacred. "This changes everything." "How many of these do we have?" 37 left. Sullivan did the math. "We just shot down 3 bombers with 3 shells. That is 100% effectiveness." "Sir, do the Japanese have anything like this?" "No." "Do the Germans?" "Not that I know of." Sullivan set the shell down carefully. "Then we have a weapon that can reliably destroy enemy aircraft, and neither enemy knows it exists." "Yes." Sullivan looked at Callahan. "This changes everything." But 2,100 miles away in Washington, Admiral Ernest King was reading a report that would keep that change locked away. The report came from the Bureau of Ordnance. Subject: Security concerns regarding variable time fuses. King read it twice, then a third time. The proximity fuse was the most secret weapon in the American arsenal. Only the atomic bomb program, which would not begin for another year, would eventually surpass it in classification. 87 companies operated 110 factories producing components. Over 80,000 workers built parts. None of them knew what they were building. Only final assembly workers at 5 facilities saw complete fuses. The security was unprecedented. The cost was extraordinary. Each fuse cost $60 in 1943 money. That was $100 in 2025 dollars for a single artillery shell. But cost was not King's concern. Security was. If a single proximity fuse fell into enemy hands intact, the consequences would be catastrophic. German or Japanese engineers could disassemble it, learn how it worked, copy the design, or develop countermeasures, jamming signals, frequency spoofing, ways to make American fuses explode prematurely or not at all. The entire technological advantage would disappear. Worse, the enemy would gain the same technology. Japanese anti-aircraft guns would become as deadly as American guns. The air superiority that American forces were beginning to establish would vanish. King looked at the recommendation. Restrict proximity fuse use to over-water engagements only. Never fire over land where dud shells could be recovered by enemy forces. If ship faces imminent capture, destroy all proximity fused ammunition before evacuation. King signed the order. 2 days later, that order reached the Joint Chiefs in a secure Pentagon briefing room. No windows. Armed guards at the door. Everyone present had clearance above top secret. King explained the restriction. We have a weapon that increases anti-aircraft effectiveness 30-fold, but we can only use it where the enemy cannot recover unexploded shells. Over water, never over land. General George Marshall stood up. His face was red. Our soldiers in Europe are dying from German air attacks. Luftwaffe fighters strafe our positions daily. Our anti-aircraft guns cannot stop them. You are telling me we have technology that would save American lives, but we refuse to use it because we are afraid? King met his eyes. I am telling you that if the Germans capture one proximity fuse, they will reverse engineer it in 6 months. Do you want to give the Luftwaffe this weapon? Marshall's voice rose. I want to stop watching casket reports. I want to stop writing letters to mothers telling them their sons died from air attacks we could have prevented. How many body bags do we fill before we use the weapons we have? Admiral William Leahy intervened. His voice was calm but firm. If the enemy develops proximity fuses, we lose our ability to defend ships from air attack. Every carrier becomes vulnerable. Every transport. We could lose control of the Pacific. Marshall turned on him. And we could lose Europe if our ground forces keep dying. We are fighting a war on multiple fronts. I need every advantage I can get. Right now. Not 6 months from now, when it is too late. The argument continued for an hour. Nobody won. The decision stood. Proximity fuses would remain restricted to over-water use. Army units in Europe would not receive them. Navy ships could use them freely over ocean, but only over ocean. The order reached Guadalcanal 10 days later. Callahan read it in his quarters. Proximity fuses authorized for continued use against airborne targets over water. Do not fire over land under any circumstances. If ship faces imminent capture, destroy all proximity fused ammunition before evacuation. He showed the message to Sullivan. They are so worried about the Japanese learning this technology that they would rather we throw the shells overboard than risk capture. Sullivan looked at the remaining shells, each one worth $60, each one capable of saving lives, each one locked behind restrictions that made it half as useful as it could be. We could mount these on our shore defenses, protect the airfield, protect the supply dumps, but we cannot because they might fall into enemy hands if the Japanese overrun our positions. Callahan folded the message. Those are the orders. Sullivan did not argue. He just loaded more shells. Over the next 6 months, Helena fought in 8 more engagements. Callahan used proximity fuses in every battle. They worked every time. His kill ratio went from 1 aircraft per 350 shells to 1 aircraft per 23 shells. A 15-fold improvement. Other ships started receiving the secret ammunition. Cruisers first, then some destroyers, always with the same restrictions. Over water only, never over land, destroy before capture. The Navy compiled statistics. In 1943, fleet anti-aircraft guns fired 36,370 rounds in combat. Only 25% used proximity fuses, but that 25% accounted for 51% of all enemy aircraft destroyed. The numbers proved what Callahan knew from watching bombers fall. The weapon worked, but only when allowed to work. July 6, 1943, the Battle of Kula Gulf. Helena was engaging Japanese destroyers at night when 3 torpedoes hit. The first torpedo struck the bow, tore a hole 40 feet wide. Water flooded forward compartments. The second torpedo hit amidships, killed power to half the ship. The third torpedo broke the keel. Helena started sinking immediately. Callahan stood on the bridge as water rushed through passageways below. He thought about the crate he had opened 6 months ago. The shells with vacuum tubes that should not have survived firing forces. The weapon that worked. The technology that could have protected more ships if Washington had not been terrified of losing the secret. The bridge tilted. Water reached his feet. 20 minutes after the first torpedo, Helena slipped beneath the surface. 732 men went into the water. 168 did not come back up. Callahan was one of them. Sullivan survived. He grabbed a floating debris when the ship went down. A destroyer picked him up 3 hours later. They transferred him to USS St. Louis, another cruiser. Sullivan kept loading proximity fuses, kept watching bombers fall when the magic shells exploded at exactly the right moment. He never told anyone what the shells contained. Security orders forbade it. The secret stayed locked until after the war ended. By then, Sullivan had fired over 2,000 proximity fused shells. He stopped counting enemy aircraft after the 100th kill. The weapon that had seemed like witchcraft in January 1943 became routine by 1945. But Sullivan never forgot the first time. The first 3 shots. The 3 bombers falling. The moment he understood that American technology had just changed warfare forever. He kept one spent shell casing from Gun 5's first proximity fuse kill. Took it home after the war. Never told anyone what made it special. Just kept it on a shelf in his garage, where he could see it every day and remember the moment everything changed. Lieutenant Commander William Saunders watched death falling from the sky. May 3rd, 1945. Radar Picket Station number 10, 40 miles north of Okinawa. USS Aaron Ward was alone. The destroyer had been on station for 18 hours, serving as an early warning post for the invasion fleet to the south. Her radar scanned constantly for incoming aircraft. At 1650 hours, the scope lit up. 12 contacts, bearing 015 degrees, range 20 miles, closing at 180 knots. Saunders grabbed the ship intercom. General quarters, all hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. He did not need to say what was coming. Every man on Aaron Ward knew. Kamikaze. The Japanese had started using kamikaze tactics 6 months earlier, October 1944, Leyte Gulf. When conventional bombing and torpedo attacks failed to stop the American advance, the Japanese turned their aircraft into guided missiles. Pilots loaded planes with explosives and fuel, then flew them directly into ships. The tactic was devastating. A bomb might miss, a torpedo might malfunction, but a kamikaze traveling at 300 miles per hour was a weapon that could not miss once committed. The pilot aimed the entire aircraft. Every gallon of fuel became explosive. Every piece of metal became shrapnel. Ships hit by kamikaze did not just take damage, they burned. The aviation fuel ignited everything it touched. Crews had seconds to fight fires before they spread beyond control. Many ships did not get those seconds. Saunders had been at Lingayen Gulf in January when kamikazes hit 6 ships in one day. He had watched USS Omine Bay burn for 4 hours before the captain ordered abandon ship. He had seen men jump into water covered with burning fuel. 395 men got off. 95 did not. He had watched USS Louisville take a kamikaze to her bridge. The explosion killed the captain and 32 officers instantly. The ship survived, but barely. Saunders knew the statistics. Between October 1944 and March 1945, kamikazes had sunk 34 American ships, damaged 368 more, killed over 4,900 sailors. The mathematics were brutal and simple. For every 100 kamikaze sorties, approximately 15 hit their targets, high enough to be catastrophic when the Japanese launched attacks in waves of dozens or hundreds of aircraft. But something had changed in March. Aaron Ward had received a special ammunition shipment, variable time fuses, proximity fuses, the shells with miniature radars that exploded automatically near targets. Saunders had tested them during a raid on March 12th. The difference was immediate. His gun crews went from firing 400 rounds per aircraft killed to firing 80, a five-fold improvement. The proximity fuses worked against kamikaze even better than against conventional bombers because kamikaze flew predictable attack profiles. They approached high to gain speed, then dove at steep angles. That meant they spent more time in the kill zone where proximity fuses were most effective. The 12 contacts kept closing. Saunders watched through binoculars. He saw them emerge from clouds at 8,000 feet. Japanese aircraft, mixed types, Zeros, Vals, Oscars, all loaded with explosives, all flying in formation toward his ship. Saunders called targeting solutions to his gun crews. Aaron Ward had 6 5-inch guns. Each could fire 15 rounds per minute. Each magazine carried 240 proximity fused shells. Open fire. All batteries. Commence firing. Aaron Ward's main battery erupted. 6 guns firing in controlled sequence. The first shells climbed into the sky. Through his director telescope, Saunders tracked them. They reached 6,000 feet and found targets. The shells exploded in a pattern around the lead kamikaze. Orange flashes, black smoke. Fragments tore through the Zero's engine cowling. Oil sprayed. The engine seized. The aircraft nosed down. Not a controlled dive, a tumble. The pilot was already dead or unconscious. The Zero fell into the ocean 2 miles from the ship. 11 targets remaining. Shift fire to bearing 017. Elevation 68 degrees. The guns tracked. Fired. Second kamikaze exploded in mid-air. The proximity fuse detonated when the shell passed 12 feet from the cockpit. The blast vaporized the pilot and tore the wings off. 10 remaining. But the other kamikazes were not waiting. They spread out, came at Aaron Ward from multiple directions. Saunders called solutions as fast as his crew could load and fire. Gun 3 destroyed a Val at 5,000 yards. Gun 5 hit an Oscar at 4,200 yards. Gun 1 killed a Zero at 3,800 yards. But 3 aircraft got through the outer defense perimeter. They were diving now, coming straight down at angles exceeding 60 degrees, speed increasing past 350 miles per hour. At that speed and angle, the 5-inch guns could not track fast enough. Saunders switched to close-in defense. All 40mm and 20mm guns. Open fire. The smaller guns opened up. Tracers filled the air. A stream of fire converging on the diving aircraft. One kamikaze caught fire at 1,200 feet. The pilot did not pull out. The aircraft kept diving. Hit the water 100 yards from Aaron Ward's stern. The explosion threw up a column of water that drenched the aft deck. The second kamikaze pulled out of its dive too late. Struck the water 50 yards from the port side, close enough that fragments hit the hull, made it ring like a bell. The third kamikaze did not miss. Saunders saw it coming. A Zero diving at 70 degrees, on fire from 40mm hits, but still flying, still controlled. The pilot aimed for the bridge. Saunders could see his face through the cockpit canopy. Young, maybe 20 years old. Blood covered the inside of the canopy. The pilot was already dying from his wounds, but still flying the aircraft, still aiming. The Zero hit Aaron Ward's superstructure between the 2 forward gun mounts. The impact tore through quarter-inch steel plating like paper. Then came the explosion. Aviation fuel ignited across 40 feet of deck. Men were caught in the fireball. Saunders saw them. Saw one sailor trying to beat out flames on another sailor who was already dead. Saw a gunner stumble from his mount, uniform on fire, screaming. The fire spread faster than damage control could contain it. Ammunition began cooking off. 5-inch shells in the ready racks exploded. Fragments tore through more men. Saunders felt the deck lurch under his feet. The ship had taken its first mortal wound. But there was no time to assess damage. The radar scope showed more contacts. 8 more aircraft. Already inside 5 miles. Already diving. What happened next would later be called the Battle of Radar Picket Station 10. For 52 minutes, Aaron Ward died slowly. The second kamikaze came from starboard, a Val bomber. It crashed into the aft deckhouse. The bomb it carried passed through the thin deck plating and exploded in the water next to the hull. The explosion blew a hole 6 feet wide in the hull, plating near the forward fire room. Water flooded in. The fire room crew had 30 seconds to evacuate before the compartment filled. 3 men did not make it. The ship lost all power. Dead in the water, a sitting duck. The third kamikaze struck amidships. A Tony fighter. It hit the base of the forward stack. The plane's 500-pound bomb exploded on impact. The blast obliterated the stack, blew a searchlight and 2 20mm guns high into the air. Most of the debris landed back on the ship, killed the men who were fighting the first fire. The fourth kamikaze came from the port side. An Oscar, on fire, trailing smoke. It crashed into the deckhouse near the aft starboard 40mm mount, ignited an even bigger gasoline fire, killed the damage control party that had been connecting fire hoses. The fifth kamikaze was a Zero. It hit the forward torpedo mount, detonated the torpedo air flasks. The explosion was tremendous. Fragments peppered the forward part of the ship, killed more men. The sixth kamikaze was the last, another Zero. It came in low and fast from forward, hit amidships at the waterline. The bomb exploded inside the hull, blew out bulkheads, flooded 3 more compartments. When the attacks finally stopped, Aaron Ward was burning in 6 locations simultaneously. The aft officers' quarters, the chief's quarters, both 40mm clipping rooms, the aft engine room. The superstructure deck from midships to stern was twisted burning metal. The forward and aft fire rooms were completely flooded. The after engine room was flooded. The machine shop was flooded. The shaft alleys were flooded. There was no water pressure in the fire mains because the pumps were underwater. The ship was in complete darkness except for the light from the fires, and enemy aircraft were still in the vicinity. Combat kept reporting more contacts. Through all of this, the crew fought to save their ship. Men repeatedly risked their lives amidst exploding ammunition and intense flames to help wounded comrades. Sailors from the aft section had to navigate through explosions and fire to reach the few remaining battle dressing stations. They did this without hesitation. Damage control parties connected portable pumps, started flooding counter-flooding compartments to keep the ship level. Medical teams worked in the dark with flashlights. 42 men were dead. Another 73 were wounded. Some of the wounds were terrible, burns covering entire bodies, shrapnel embedded in flesh, men missing limbs. The medical team ran out of morphine after 20 minutes. The wounded who came after that had to endure without it. Saunders walked through what remained of his ship after the fires were under control. It took him 30 minutes to get from the bridge to the stern because normal passageways were blocked by wreckage. He had to climb over twisted metal, step around bodies covered in canvas. The living spaces were destroyed. The mess decks were flooded. The engine rooms were flooded. The ship had no power except from one forward emergency diesel generator. That single generator was keeping the bilge pumps running. If it failed, the ship would sink. Saunders found the chief damage control officer in what used to be the aft engine room. The compartment was flooded to the overhead. The chief was standing in water up to his chest, directing a salvage party that was trying to shore up a bulkhead. The chief looked at Saunders. "We can save her, sir. If that bulkhead holds and we can keep the pumps running, we can save her." Saunders sat down on an ammunition crate in the passageway, put his face in his hands. His entire body was shaking. He could not stop it, could not control it. The adrenaline that had kept him functional during the attack was draining away, leaving nothing but exhaustion and the realization of how close they had come to dying. How many men had died? How many were maimed? He thought about the young Japanese pilot he had seen through the cockpit canopy. Already dying, already bleeding, but still flying, still aiming, still trying to kill them. That kind of determination was terrifying. You could shoot at it, burn it, hit it with 40mm shells, and it kept coming, kept flying, right up until the moment of impact. At 2106 hours, the destroyer Shannon took Aaron Ward in tow. The seas were calm. Shannon could pull the damaged ship slowly back to Karama-Retto. They arrived on the morning of May 4th. Aaron Ward received a message from Fleet Admiral Nimitz. "We all admire a ship that cannot be licked. Tell your crew well done." Aaron Ward would survive. The crew had saved her, but she would never fight again. The damage was too extensive. After temporary repairs at Karama-Retto, she was towed to Seattle. Surveyors examined her and recommended decommissioning. The cost to repair her exceeded the cost of building a new destroyer. Aaron Ward was stricken from the Naval Register in September 1945 and sold for scrap in 1946. Saunders wrote his after-action report in the hospital at Karama-Retto. His hands still shook when he held the pen. Without proximity fuses, this vessel would have been overwhelmed in the first 10 minutes. Conventional time-fused ammunition would have required precise range finding for each target. With multiple attackers approaching from different angles at high speed, our fire control systems would have been unable to keep pace. The proximity fuse allowed our guns to engage and destroy targets without precise range data. We shifted fire between threats in seconds instead of minutes. This capability saved the ship. 11 kamikazes approached. We destroyed 4 before they reached the ship. The remaining 7 hit us. Without those 4 kills, Aaron Ward would have taken 11 impacts instead of 6. The ship would have sunk. All 309 crew would have been lost. The Navy read Saunders' report. They read similar reports from 30 other ships that fought at Okinawa. The statistics told a clear story. Between April 1st and June 22nd, 1945, the Navy expended 150,000 proximity-fused 5-inch shells at Okinawa. Those shells accounted for 44% of all anti-aircraft ammunition fired, but they were responsible for approximately 70% of all kamikaze kills at ranges beyond 2,000 yards. Ships equipped with proximity fuses destroyed kamikaze at rates 7 times higher than ships using conventional ammunition. The difference translated directly into survival. Destroyers with full proximity fuse magazines had a 67% chance of surviving concentrated kamikaze attacks. Destroyers that exhausted their proximity fuse stocks and reverted to conventional ammunition had a 31% chance. By August 1945, when the war ended, the proximity fuse had become the single most important factor in American naval survival in the Pacific. Over 22 million proximity fuse were manufactured during the war. The total cost exceeded $1 billion in 1945 money. That was equivalent to $18 billion in 2025 currency. The most expensive conventional weapons program in history to that point. But the return was measurable. Between January 1943 and August 1945, proximity fused ammunition accounted for approximately 80% of all enemy aircraft destroyed by naval anti-aircraft fire. The weapon increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors ranging from 3 times to 30 times, depending on conditions. Ships saved numbered in the hundreds. Lives saved numbered in the tens of thousands. Saunders recovered from his wounds, returned to duty in July 1945 aboard USS Missouri. He was on the bridge when Japan surrendered in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. Missouri's guns were loaded with proximity-fused shells. Every ship in the fleet carried them, but they were never fired in anger again. The weapon that had been developed in desperation, tested in secret, and deployed under the strictest security restrictions in military history, had helped win the war. Then it disappeared from public knowledge. The proximity fuse remained classified until 1950. Most Americans never learned that such a weapon existed. The sailors who had fired the shells and the engineers who had built them kept quiet. Security restrictions stayed in place. Only when the technology became obsolete did the Navy finally acknowledge what had happened. Saunders kept one memento from Aaron Ward, a spent shell casing from Gun 5, the gun that had fired the first proximity fused shell during the battle. He took it home after the war, never told anyone what made it special, just kept it on a shelf in his garage where he could see it every day. On quiet mornings, he would hold that casing and remember the 12 kamikazes diving, remember the fires, remember the screaming, remember the sailors who fought to save their ship, remember the young Japanese pilot with blood on his canopy, remember the moment when American technology met Japanese desperation, and both sides discovered that wars are won not by bravery alone, but by the weapons that turn bravery into survival. August 28, 1945, Washington, D.C. The war had ended 13 days ago. Cities were celebrating. Bands played on street corners. Flags waved from every building. Sailors kissed girls in Times Square. But in Merle Tuve's laboratory at the Applied Physics Lab, there was no celebration, only silence and numbers. Tuve sat alone reading casualty reports from Okinawa. 4,907 American sailors killed, the bloodiest naval campaign in American history. He turned to the next page. Navy analysts had done calculations. Estimated casualties without proximity fuses, 12,000 dead. Estimated ship losses, 60 vessels sunk instead of 36. The proximity fuse had saved approximately 7,000 lives, prevented the sinking of 24 ships, and nobody outside the military would ever know. Tuve opened his wartime notebook, the one where he had recorded every failed vacuum tube test. 63 failures before the first success. Each failure documented with date, test conditions, cause of death. Tube 1, shattered at 100 times gravity. Tube 17, filament broke at 3,400 times gravity. Tube 47, exploded in his hand. The blood from the glass cuts had stained page 12. He had never cleaned it off. On the last page of the notebook, Tuve had written names, sailors he had met during the war, men who had thanked him personally for proximity fuses that saved their ships. 12 names. Captain Reynolds from USS South Dakota, Lieutenant Chen from USS Oakland, Chief Sullivan from USS Helena. After the war ended, Tuve had checked each name against casualty lists. 8 were dead, killed before proximity fuses reached their ships in sufficient numbers, or killed by kamikazes that got through anyway. 4 survivors, 8 dead. Tuve stared at the names for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and put his head in his hands. The phone rang. Tuve let it ring 6 times before answering. "This is Tuve." The voice belonged to Vannevar Bush. "Merle, I have news. The Navy is keeping proximity fuse technology classified indefinitely. We cannot publish, cannot speak at conferences, cannot tell anyone outside the program what we built." Tuve said nothing. Bush continued, "I know this is not what you wanted to hear, but the technology is too valuable. The Soviets are already trying to copy it. If we release technical details now, we hand them 5 years of research." Tuve found his voice. "How long does the classification last?" Bush paused. 5 years minimum, maybe 10, until the technology becomes obsolete or the threat changes. Tuve looked at his notebook, at the bloodstain on page 12, at the names on the last page. "So the men who died will never know what we built for them, and the men we saved will never be able to talk about it." "That is correct." Tuve hung up without saying goodbye. But secrets have a way of emerging. In November 1945, Life magazine published an article about war technology. Brief mention of radio-controlled shells. No technical details, just acknowledgement that the weapon existed. The Navy tried to maintain complete secrecy, but information leaked. Engineers talked to other engineers. Sailors told stories in bars. By 1947, most people in the defense industry knew American ships used advanced fuse technology. Foreign intelligence services certainly knew. Soviet spies had been trying to acquire proximity fuses since 1943. In 1944, a Soviet operative recovered fragments from downed aircraft wreckage over England. One American anti-aircraft shell had failed to detonate completely. The damaged but partially intact fuse was recovered before Allied cleanup teams arrived. Soviet scientists were now reverse engineering the technology, facing the same problems Tuve had faced 5 years earlier. Tom Sullivan understood what the weapon meant. The old gunner who had loaded the first proximity fused shells on USS Helena in 1943 kept his shell casing on a shelf in his garage. After the Navy declassified the technology in 1950, Sullivan finally told his family what it represented. His grandson asked if the war would have been lost without proximity fuses. Sullivan thought for a long time before answering. We would not have lost the war, but we would have lost a lot more ships, a lot more men. Every sailor who survived a kamikaze attack because proximity fuses shot down the plane before it hit, that sailor owed his life to engineers who built something everyone said was impossible. We were firing shells that thought for themselves, shells that knew when to explode. That was science fiction turned real. In 1950, the Korean War started. American forces in Korea needed every advantage. The Navy declassified proximity fuse technology on July 15th. For the first time, the public learned how the weapon worked. Newspapers called it a miracle weapon, a shell with a brain, technology that had turned the tide in the Pacific. But by 1950, most Americans had moved on from World War II. Korea dominated headlines. The proximity fuse became a footnote in military history books. Most people never understood how revolutionary it was. In 1951, President Truman presented Tuve with the Presidential Medal of Merit. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service in the development of the proximity fuse, a revolutionary advance in ordnance which saved countless American lives and contributed immeasurably to the defeat of the enemy." Tuve accepted the medal, shook the president's hand, smiled for photographs. Reporters asked him how it felt to receive the nation's highest civilian honor. Tuve said it was an honor to serve. He said the proximity fuse was a team effort. He thanked the engineers and factory workers and sailors who made it possible. Then he left. That night, alone in his hotel room, Tuve opened his wartime notebook again, turned to the last page, the page with 12 names, 8 of them dead. He sat on the bed holding the medal in one hand and the notebook in the other. The medal was heavy, gold-plated bronze, engraved with his name, but the notebook weighed more. Tuve set the medal on the nightstand. He would never display it. It would stay in a drawer for the rest of his life, because medals are given to individuals. But the proximity fuse was not one man's achievement. Hundreds of engineers had worked on it. Thousands of factory workers had built components. Tens of thousands of sailors had fired the shells in combat. The medal should have been shared by everyone who contributed. But medals do not work that way. History remembers individuals, forgets the teams behind them. Tuve lay in bed staring at the ceiling until morning came. He never opened the medal case again. Tom Sullivan died in 1987 at age 85. At his funeral, his grandson gave the eulogy. He mentioned Sullivan had served in the Navy, fought in the Pacific, survived kamikaze attacks, but the grandson did not mention proximity fuses because he still did not fully understand their significance. After the funeral, the grandson cleaned out Sullivan's garage, found the shell casing on the shelf, no label, No explanation. Just a piece of brass from his grandfather's war. The grandson almost threw it away, almost tossed it in the trash with the rest of the old war memorabilia nobody wanted anymore. But something made him keep it. The casing sat in a box in the grandson's attic for 20 years. In 2007, while cleaning the attic, the grandson found it again. He researched it online, learned what proximity fuses were, learned what they did, realized what his grandfather had been part of, the weapon that had changed naval warfare. The grandson donated the casing to the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. The shell casing sits there now in a display case. Next to it is a placard explaining what proximity fuses accomplished. How between 1943 and 1945 they increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by factors ranging from 3 to 30 times depending on conditions. How ships equipped with proximity fuses survived kamikaze attacks at twice the rate of ships using conventional ammunition. How over 22 million fuses were manufactured at a cost exceeding $1 billion $1945. Most visitors walk past without stopping. They do not know what they are looking at, do not understand what it means. The weapon that could not miss, the technology that saved tens of thousands of lives, the secret that stayed secret for 5 years after the war and then faded into history. Merle Tuve died in 1982 at age 82. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned he was a physicist who worked on defense projects during World War II. One paragraph near the end mentioned the proximity fuse. Most readers skipped over it. Tuve's family found his wartime notebook among his possessions. The notebook with blood on page 12 and names on the last page. They donated it to the Smithsonian Institution. It sits in their archives now. Few people asked to see it, but the technology Tuve developed lives on. Modern anti-aircraft missiles use proximity fuses. Air-to-air missiles use them. Surface-to-air missiles use them. The fundamental principle remains. The weapon decides when to explode based on proximity to target. That idea was revolutionary in 1940. It is standard in 2025. And it all started with a physicist staring at a broken vacuum tube in a laboratory in Washington, trying to build something everyone said was impossible. The shell casing sits in its display case in Texas, silent. Most visitors walk past. They do not stop. They do not read the placard. They do not know. The weapon that saved thousands of lives and then disappeared into history, remembered by almost no one except the men who are no longer alive to remember. If you had worked on the proximity fuse for 5 years, saved 7,000 lives, and then been told you could never talk about it, could you have stayed silent? Tuve did. Most engineers did. Most sailors did. Comment whether you could have kept that secret. And if you think today's military technology will be just as forgotten in 80 years, subscribe. We're documenting what gets erased.